Hey, today on FlyWire, this is episode 3 of the unleaded true history, or whatever we want to call it, of Avgas and where we're going with aviation gasoline in the United States. So episode 3, we're going to talk to GAMI, the folks at GAMI who have the G100UL. So stick with me on FlyWire. Hey, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire, we're going to talk to Tim Royal. He's the president of GAMI, General Aviation Modifications Incorporated, Ada, Oklahoma, and George Brawley, who is
Head of engineering.
Head of engineering, and he's the corporate lawyer too, I think, right?
Not very often.
So we're going to get into detail here in just a second, but what I've done is I pinned him here at the beach bash at the Bluegrass, and we're going to ask him a bunch of questions about G100UL. So I think you might find that interesting. Thanks for meeting me, guys. And hopefully we can go through a lot of questions. Here's the interesting thing. Just a few minutes ago, I got a call from this fellow at the NTSB, and he said he saw my first two videos in the unleaded aviation fuel story, and he had a question for me. And I said, well, by coincidence, I'm fixing to talk to the GAMI folks, so I'll ask him that question. We'll start off with that. And that is
Talk about a surprise question.
I was going to say, I may have to talk to my lawyer about that. Fire away.
Yeah, so his question was, he said, well, I've gone and taken an airplane out of, he's just been sitting for 10 years and had avgas in it, and fuel was just fine and it flew away on that fuel. They've been sitting in that tank for 10 years. So his question is about stability. What is the stability of G100UL?
Interesting, good question. Not all 100 OLED will do that. Okay, some versions, and it depends a little bit on where it was in storage. You know what the ambient conditions were. But we know that G100UL in storage for 3 years plus in Mobile, Alabama. When it was returned to us in the same drums that we shipped it, it was just fine. So there's no crisis with the storage stability. The fuel appears to work at least as well, and it probably will work a little better than 100 low lead with respect to long-term storage stability.
That's good news. I like that.
There are really two issues with respect to that. One are gum formation over time, and the other is vapor pressure. So the G100UL is very similar to 100 low lead in much of its chemistry. It has exactly the same vapor pressure, uses the same components to maintain the vapor pressure. But with changing temperatures over time, either fuel will lose some of the light ends in the vapor pressure, and that needs to be considered if you have fuel stored not in a sealed container. And gum formation, the G100UL is excellent. It has a high level of antioxidants in it, and it will last years and years in terms of any gum formation, so really no issues.
Okay, just a quick word about vapor pressure, if you will. When is that really important? Is that important at near sea level, below 10,000 feet, or has it become more important above?
It's really important in Minnesota in the wintertime, because if you want to get your Mooney started, you better have fuel that has vapor pressure that's at least in the middle of the spec range or above, or otherwise you're going to be doing what one FAA employee I know does with his Mooney in New Jersey, and he has to get a can of ether and go out there and spray it in the filter to get his Mooney started on a cold day in the wintertime.
Okay, well that's good. It's good to know. So this whole chemistry thing in avgas is a very, very complicated issue.
But I mean, the EPA does that for automobile gasoline. They titrate the vapor pressure for winter fuel versus summer fuel in order to minimize the total transfer of hydrocarbons into the atmosphere.
And they blend it differently.
Yeah,
yes,
that's because the volume of the turnover is so high. And you make a refinery 10 million gallon tank of auto gas today, and it's probably going to be consumed within 30 days, 60 days on the outside. Avgas a lot of times is a year and a half before it really gets consumed.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I use avgas in all my lawnmower type stuff. I don't use regular fuel. and it's great. Yeah, it works really well. So one of the critical things I think the differences here, or the situation with GAMI, is that you guys have a very sophisticated engine test stand. So when you use this, I'm very interested in why you have the test stand and how you use it and how it's affected the G100UL project.
You know, it's really kind of an almost apocryphal story, but we used the former vice president of engineering for Continental that designed a bunch of the big Continental engines. His name was Carl Glay, and he had retired, but we used him as a DER for the early fuel injector projects. And I remember almost to the moment, we had just finished, the two of us had finished a flight to 25,000 feet for the turbo GAM ejector fuel injectors. And we got back to Ada, and I was asking him questions about internal cylinder pressures and stuff like that. And he just flat out told me, he said, look, you guys are really good with software and engine stuff. You need to build a test stand. I said, well, it's expensive. He said, no, you don't understand. You will not believe how much you will learn and what you can do if you've got a really good high-quality engine test stand. And we took that to heart and spent the money in 1999 and got it constructed, and ended up naming him after Mr. Glay, the Carl Glay Memorial Engine Test Facility. And a lot of people that are sophisticated in this part of the general aviation world that have been there, including one guy that has been in almost every race car engine test facility in the world, sat there in our test facility, 6 or 8 months ago, and he flat out told us, he said, I've never been in an engine test facility that has the capability that you guys have here. And it's been the key to an enormous amount of the successful innovations that Tim and GAMI and Tornado Alley have been able to develop.
Because you can come up with the idea, make the change, and then test it and see if it works.
And
Well,
collect the data.
And collect the data.
The products live based on the data, and we're able to educate people about why things are important and show them the data.
Yeah.
And the cycle time is really critical because, for instance, when we were in the November, December 2009 through July of 2010, when we were first developing and perfecting the formulation for G100, there were times when we'd go out in the morning and we would put together a drum of fuel from components that we had in our inventory, put it on the test stand, run it, have the results by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and figure out what didn't work, and go back the next morning and make a second pass and a third pass day after day after day, and our cycle time was 24 hours for doing that. Whereas in most places that are doing this sort of thing, their cycle time might be 2 days or a month for this sort of thing. And it was the ability to do that. And another aspect of it that almost nobody really understands and appreciates is that once we got that test stand built and operational in 2000, word sort of leaked out, and during the period of time from 2004 to 2008, we had 4 different large batches shipped to us in drums from 3 different well-known refiners that wanted us to test their candidate unleaded aviation gasolines because we could do it and do it on a confidential basis and report the results to them and do it on a timely basis. And so we learned an awful lot about what doesn't work during that 4-year period of time, that when Tim and I came back from Florida after the AOPA convention in 2009, after the Obama administration came in, and everybody started panicking over lead going away, and we looked at each other like we were both crazy and decided to start this project. The best part of it is we knew an awful lot about what does not work, and it let us avoid a lot of mistakes that other people have made and continue to make.
Well, to be honest with you, my background is physics, so I'm not a chemist, but I'm I look at the world through the eyes of a physicist, and I'm a bit of a geek for data and real science. So frankly, I'm fascinated by the engine test stand and what you can do
We'd
and what
like
have
you to
done.
come to Ada, and we'll run some fuel in the test stand and show you a lot of things about internal cylinder combustion pressures and the nuances of why that's important.
Well, thanks. I would love to do that. That's awesome.
One of the things that was critical was that we started noticing some serious discrepancies between the way that unleaded fuels with the same motor octane number, let's say you've got 3 unleaded fuels with a motor octane number of 100.0, and you've got 100 low lead that's got a motor octane number of 100.0. And you take those 4 different fuels, and if you just look at the laboratory test value, it all says 100.0. But you put them on the full-scale aircraft engine, and all 4 of them would run differently. In 2012, at the end of the preliminary program that was called the UATARC, the Unleaded Avgas Transition Aviation Rulemaking Committee, there was a memorandum that was put out by the guy that runs the engine test stand in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And in that part of that final report that's out there on the internet, there's a statement in there that, one of the things we've got to be careful of is that unleaded fuels with the same motor octane number as 100 low lead don't necessarily perform the same. He was exactly right. The problem is they never figured out why, and we have. And we've been able to figure that out, and it turns out that it goes both ways. Some unleaded fuel chemistries with 100 motor octane don't perform as well as 100 low lead. Some unleaded fuels with different fuel chemistries, the right fuel chemistries, with a motor octane of 100, outperform 100 low lead with a motor octane of 100. And so if we hadn't had the test stand, we would have been lost in a wilderness and never been able to decipher that and get to where we are.
Yeah.
Not to mention that 100 low lead is not always the same.
Yeah.
The chemistry varies a good bit, depending on who's making it and what they have available. It has performance parameters that it has to make, but its chemistry is really quite variable.
Yeah, and that I find is very interesting for a standard that's kind of a so-so standard.
It's actually not that unusual.
Yeah. So how many G100UL test hours do you think you've done on the engine test stand?
Oh, probably 500, maybe 600.
On the test stand. How many in airplanes? Because you have been running it in airplanes for quite a while.
So,
And what airplanes?
yeah, so one of the requirements for any new fuel is that you have to do a standard FAA, what's called a block test, which is, if you're certifying a brand new engine, you've got to run this test protocol, which is called the FAA Block Test. And it's a complicated, but 150-hour test. But it's all done at very high power and at limit temperatures. And it's designed to be the straightforward way to certify an engine without having to run it thousands of hours. And so you had to do that with a new fuel chemistry. And so we had the fuel running at Embry-Riddle in a program that we were starting down there with thank God they pitched in early to help. And we were working with an FAA project engineer that was out of the Atlanta certification office. And he proposed, he said, why don't we do this engine block test, which we normally do on a test stand, why don't we do it on an aircraft? And he said, we'll get lots of extra information from doing it on an aircraft and answer a lot of negative people's questions. And I said, yeah, we can do that. He said, well, good, we'll just go talk to Embry-Riddle and we'll get them to put a new engine on one of their airplanes and we'll do that. And I said, let me throw a crazy idea at the FAA. Now, How often do you throw a crazy idea at the FAA and get them to say yes? Doesn't happen very often, but with the really good engineers in the FAA, and this guy was one of the very best and experienced in this area, what we said to him was, we don't want to use a new engine. We want to use a high-time engine. Because somebody's going to complain, well, what happens all these these high-time engines, if you change fuel chemistry, what's that going to do to the engine? And I said, we'd be better off if we'll put all those people to bed. And he said, well, that's a high-risk deal because you got to go 150 hours on a high-time engine instead of a new engine. I said, we'll run the risk. He said, well, let me think about it. So he came back a day later and said, no, that's not going to work. I said, why not? He said, well, we've got to be able to measure the wear rate. And if we're starting with a worn engine, we don't have the measurements on the parts, so we can't measure the wear rate. I said, well, let me think about it. So I called him the next day and I said, I got an idea. Those engines are 4-cylinder Lycomings. The engine that's on that airplane that they want to use has got 1,400 hours. Why don't we take 2 of those cylinders off, get inside the engine, measure everything we can measure, and then overhaul 2 cylinders, measure all the parts, and go back on with 2 new cylinders and 2 old cylinders, and then we get the best of both worlds. He said, yeah. He said, let's do that. Well, this is what it takes to do something like this. It takes people that are willing to think outside the box. Mm-hmm. But if it makes good engineering sense, then that's what ought to be done. And in this case, the FAA was fully on board with it, and that's what we did. We ran that 1,400-hour engine, nearly 190 hours more, and then disassembled it and measured all the new parts, remeasured them as used parts, and then measured all the old used parts, and everything on that engine was still within service limits and eligible for continued service, including the carburetor parts and the seals and the float and all that other stuff that's fuel wetted intensely as a result of the testing.
That's great.
Sometimes the FAA does some really good stuff, and
Yeah.
that was a good example of it.
That was actually more than that, more than the regular 150-hour test in the real world.
It was a fully independent assessment by a knowledgeable party too, so we were fortunate to have.
Yeah, I mean, we had nothing to do with the test other than we made the fuel in Oklahoma and shipped it down there in drums. But the FAA went down on almost a weekly basis to monitor the testing, and the FAA was there for all the interval maintenance inspections, and then the FAA was there personally supervising the engine teardown. And so it was a completely third-party independent test done with the direct oversight of, at the time, probably the single most experienced propulsion engineer in the FAA.
It's pretty rigorous. And I think most people know, or most viewers probably know, that AOPA basically had a Bonanza, Barron donated for about 200 hours. I think you guys did 180 of one engine on G100UL and the other engine on 100 low lead.
You know, and AOPA gets an enormous amount of credit for doing that. It was a wonderful idea. It was their idea. They came to us with the proposal and said, we'll do it for anybody else's fuel if somebody wants to, come along. But the data that we got out of that with respect to the maintenance parameters for the spark plugs and the oil analysis is laboratory quality data. You really, you can take a good engineer and a scientist and try and pick the validity of that data apart, and you really can't do it. I mean, even, for example, the oil analysis shows that the wear metals on the left engine with the G100 unleaded fuel were down by 40 to 60% across the board on all the wear metals. And then the wear metals on the right-hand engine, and these were both freshly overhauled engines, we're talking at 180-something hours of time. They were all completely normal. You say, well, how do you know they were normal? How do you know this is not a fluke? Because the good Blackstone people, they put their fleet average for that engine, and their fleet average values for engines run on 100 low lead matched the values for the right engine on the Barron almost perfectly, which meant that the data wasn't a fluke. It was valid data that was consistent with industry experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I also think that You guys in Tornado Alley doing the turbo normalizer for Beechcraft and Cessna Cardinals, I think it is. But you also did it for Cirrus. And you've been running a Cirrus on G100UL for a long time, right?
Yes.
We first put G100UL, and I made the first flight on January 27th, 2010. Of some interest, less than 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from Tulsa on a Friday, and the guy that calls me says, "Hey, I hear about this fuel. I want to come fly it. Can I come down tomorrow morning and go fly it with you?" It was Senator James Inhofe. He was the second person, the second person other than George Brawley, to fly G100UL Avgas, and he did it in that Cirrus in February of that year. And then a couple of weeks later, Alan Quagmire from Cirrus came down and did the same thing. And then later that year, a flight engineer from both Lycoming and Continental came and did the same thing, and all of them reported back that it works transparently with 100 low lead.
And how many hours have you put on that Cirrus?
Oh, it's got not too many, but it's got probably 200, 250 hours. Not all of that has been on G100, but it's been a good field test because we've gone back and forth. But it's had G100UL in the fuel tanks and in the fuel lines and all that stuff for most of the time for the last 15 years and for all of the time for the last 2 years.
Which actually brings me to the big controversy that is rolling out there on the interweb these days about the swelling of seals and how G100UL affects seals. So let's talk about that a little bit?
Well, G100UL has got aromatics in it. Some 100 low lead has a lot of aromatics in it. We've got a laboratory detailed hydrocarbon analysis of a batch of 100 low lead that was made by Phillips Petroleum in 2010 at their refinery in Borger, Texas. And it shows that fuel's got 33% aromatics in it, 29% of which is toluene. World War II Avgas that we won World War II with, did the invasion with, had more aromatics than that in it. Aromatics in aviation gasoline are nothing new, but it is true that compared to some versions of 100 low lead, that it will swell the O-rings more than others. But you really do want an O-ring to swell, not shrink, because when it's captured, performing its intended function, if it swells, that just means it seals better. Now, if you disassemble the part and you look at it, the O-ring may have gotten bigger than what you're used to seeing, but it was performing its intended function. And so that's the pass-fail criteria. And we've not yet seen an example where they won't continue to do that. But there is best practice maintenance advice that goes back to the 1980s for the mechanics when they're working on a fuel system and they encounter an old historic nitrile or Buna-N O-ring or seal to replace it with fluorosilicon or fluorocarbide as a maintenance best practice. Cessna changed out their O-ring and seal kits for their Cessna 400s and went to fluorosilicon fluorocarbons in 1991, 35 years ago, folks. There's nothing new about this being the best practice. At Sun and Fun just a month ago, we went over to the people that make the drain valves, Curtis. They've got an array of 40 or so of those drain valves, Tim. And I was talking to them, and I said, well, have you guys ever thought about getting rid of your nitrile O-rings and going to Viton? And the guy looked at me and grinned from ear to ear and said, George, we did that 2 years ago. Okay. This is just standard maintenance best practice, just like, we went from black rubber hoses to Teflon hoses for the same reasons.
But so the Buna-N or the other nitrile O-rings, in particular, this guy in California did a test where he submerged these things, I think for a week, and one swelled in G100 low lead and it didn't swell in G100 unleaded, and G100 or regular 100 low lead, it didn't swell. So if it's swelled, what's actually happening there, and why did it swell, and does it stay there and you never can use that?
You know, if you measured the width or the diameter of the material in the O-ring, it's going to get a little larger. That makes the O-ring diameter, unconstrained, get larger. Let me give you an example. We did a fuel tank material compatibility test for the world's largest general aviation aircraft manufacturer. And they had a rubber bladder fuel tank. And it was kind of a unique construction, had lots of angles and whatnot, and they were worried about all the seals and overlays and mating surfaces. So they sent us one. It was actually a new reject for some minor defect. And we set up a test protocol. We put 100 low lead in it for a couple of weeks, and drained that, put G100 in it for a while, nothing. Well, then we drained that, and then we put G100 in it and circulated it at 140 degrees for 6 weeks or something to try and accelerate any chemical reactions. And then we had to inspect it. Well, it had an aluminum panel on the bottom of the tank, about this big, this big. And we unbolted it, and it was sealed with an O-ring, about this big. Now, it wasn't leaking, seeping, dripping, or anything. But when we unsealed it, that O-ring, instead of being this big, was this big. And so we were getting ready to send it back to them because they wanted it back to look at it. I said, well, let's order an O-ring. We'll put a new O-ring in there. So 3 days later, the new O-ring shows up, and I went to put it back together again, and I looked at the original O-ring, and it was back to the original size. We put it back in, put it back together, and shipped it back to the manufacturer for an inspection. This is pretty standard stuff. And by the way, some 100 low lead, in particular some of the stuff that's used there in the Bay Area in California, it happens to be fairly low in aromatics. But there's other 100 low lead around the country right now today that's pretty high in aromatics. So it depends a little bit when you're doing this back-to-back testing. You have to understand that aspect of the fuel chemistry and be able to pick, the worst case and the worst case for doing that kind of testing.
Yeah, in fact, when they introduced the SAF into jet fuel, the sustainable aviation fuel, they ran into a problem where the lack of aromatics in the fuel that is common was not letting the O-rings swell as they did historically, and they were having leaks for that reason. So it's more the norm.
That's interesting. The other side of that controversy is the effect of the fuel G100UL on paint.
Well, it really depends, what you're comparing against, because certainly 100 low lead over the years has leaked and damaged paint in lots of instances too. So we learned that if your airplane leaks 100 low lead, it will also leak G100UL. And if you don't pay attention to the leak and you let the G100UL sit on your paint, depending on your paint, it may impact the paint. And so proper fuel hygiene, as we like to say, is important. Pay attention to the maintenance of your airplane. Try not to let it leak. If you spill G100 on it and wipe it off, you should be fine. But I think, there's a lot of variation in types of paint and coatings, but generally it's a matter of limited exposure is fine.
The overriding consideration is there is no perfect fuel. Certainly it's not 100 low lead. If you look at a spark plug at 50 hours and you're maintaining an R28 or a pair, or God forbid, 4 R2800s on a commemorative Air Force airplane, and you have to clean the spark plugs every 50 hours, there's 18 cylinders times 2 on each engine. It takes 3 or 4 people a day just to pull the spark plugs. Not having to do that kind of routine maintenance is a huge benefit. There's going to be trade-offs. There's no perfect 100 low lead, and G100UL is not a perfect fuel, but we've never had a perfect fuel ever. But it works, and it works for all the engines that that are in the FAA's database of spark ignition piston engines.
So that actually brings me into I think the chemistry of this situation is you guys have, the way I understand it is you've made the fuel using aromatics as your octane boost. To
Well,
boost
not
the
solely.
octane.
I mean,
Not solely, but
fuel is more similar than different, I think, from 100 low lead. But we do tend to use some premium quality components to keep the octane levels up where it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, on average, somewhere between 57 and 68 or 70%, 68% of, well, in some cases, yeah, close to 70% of G100UL is made of the same kinds of components, the same basic molecular components that are used in 100 low lead.
Mm-hmm.
We typically use better quality refinery runs of those, particularly the alkylate, the Aviation alkylate. And they're premium versions of the same refinery streams that are used in 100 low lead. They cost more because they're premium versions of those same refinery streams. But it was a combination of all of those, plus a couple of ingredients that are somewhat unique to G100UL, although they've all been used in various forms of automotive gasoline, even in various places around the world over the decades, and put that magic combination together in just the right proportions, and we found a fuel that works.
Now, part of that, the fuel is a little bit unconventional in terms of those premium quality components, and they're not always found at the refineries that currently make 100 low lead. So it may not fit quite the bill as 100 low lead does for the current producers to make this fuel, but on the other hand, the components are readily available.
By other producers.
Yeah, in volume components, and they can be blended outside of the refinery, so there are benefits to the manufacturer of it as well.
which not, as long as we're talking about that, it actually skips to a question I have later on, but we might as well deal with it now. So making of the fuel, all right, you guys aren't making the fuel. What you do essentially is you license it to a maker, and right now I think it's Viton in Louisiana?
Vitol,
Vitol.
V-I-T-O-L.
Okay.
Vitol, which is a Swiss company based in Geneva, but they're the world's largest independently owned petroleum company, facilities all over the world. They have blending facilities in Houston, and for the G100UL, they made use of some facilities they leased in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So that's currently where they have what was once 1 million plus gallons.
So your role the GAMI role in the fuel is that you basically license it to anybody that wants to make
Exactly. Yeah.
And let's say that an FAA certificate holder, let's say it's Cessna, they're producing a Cessna. They are what is called the production approval holder for that aircraft. Well, GAMI is the production approval holder for GAM ejectors, and Tornado Alley Turbo for the turbo systems that go into, Bonanzas and Cardinals and Cirruses and things like that. Well, the same regulatory structure applies with respect to the fuel. We are the production approval holder for the production of this product that is used in aircraft and engines. And so, just like Cessna or Boeing can license somebody to make a landing gear for their airplane, authorized
with their engineering data.
with using the
Specifications.
approved engineering data from the FAA, we can license somebody using the approved engineering data for the fuel to produce the fuel. And we've actually done this in a way that enhances the quality assurance that goes into the fuel. Because, for instance, under our licensing agreement, a producer like Vitol, if they have a quality fallout and the fuel doesn't meet the spec for some reason, then if the FAA gets concerned, they can go audit their records and determine that they're no longer a qualified producer. That doesn't happen with 100 low lead that is in the existing world. The FAA's got no ability or insight or ability to do that sort of thing. So we've actually improved, if you will, the quality control chain for this fuel as compared to the existing production of traditional aviation gasolines.
And of course, we've shared this specification with several large producers, and they've reviewed it, and they consider it perfectly adequate in terms of their ability to make it to the specification.
Okay, so, and my understanding of it is when you didn't do the ASTM process, and you actually started before they even, PAFI even started.
Correct.
You know, you guys actually had a fuel up and running by then. But you didn't participate in that process. But what you did when you developed it is, clarify me if I'm wrong, is you actually used their testing protocols and guidelines, et cetera, and that's how you developed your...
No, not at all.
No?
Exactly the opposite.
Okay.
We developed a bunch of these testing protocols, and they adopted a bunch of them to stick into the PAFI program.
Yeah. Although our specification uses all ASTM specifications to define the various performance parameters, much as 100 low lead, is in accordance with ASTM D910. So you hold the two specifications next to each other. They look very similar, except that we have some additional state-of-the-art detailed hydrocarbon analysis that is a key part of every batch of our fuel that makes it individualized and identifiable as such.
And essentially, okay, with that detailed hydrocarbon analysis, basically, does that mean that this maker and the fuel manufacturer in California and the one in Louisiana and the one in England, they have to make it exactly the same to that spec?
Well, I think nothing's ever exactly the same. The specification defines the bounds for all of the
Right.
components.
Okay.
But the detailed hydrocarbon analysis is an assessment, kind of like a fingerprint, essentially, or a DNA analysis that looks at all of the specifics and quantifies all of those characteristics down to a very small margin, so that the batches are very easily identifiable as such.
Yeah, it's a significant enhancement in terms of protecting the FBOs and the producers of the fuel from frivolous litigation in the event that there's an unfortunate airplane accident and somebody suspects that the fuel played some role in it. If the NTSB can recover almost as little as a thimbleful of fuel from a fuel line or a servo or a carburetor bowl or a corner of a fuel tank somewhere, at the scene of the accident, they can have that reanalyzed at the same laboratory that did the batch of fuel. And we're talking about identifying the hydrocarbons down to a tenth of 1% of each of several hundred different actual hydrocarbon molecules, and be able to determine whether or not the fuel conformed to the specification with almost a theologically certain level of confidence.
And to determine if there was any contamination at the same time.
Yeah, and probably get a forensic person's interest excited, because we can probably give them a good idea of where the contamination came from by the nature of it.
So it's traceable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it really does provide an enhanced level of protection at the FBO for misfueling, refueling. On the other hand, if they screw up, it's going to identify that too with a high level of certainty.
Yeah, could be a risk there for them.
Well, people are competent, and this encourages competence in that area. I mean, it's overall an enormous safety benefit for the fleet.
Yeah. So what is the detonation performance of G100UL versus 100 low lead? And I'm sure you've tested against 100, 130, 115, 45.
Second to none.
So what is the I think if you watched my previous video, I talked about the rich and the lean numbers. They're different, and how they. The easy way to look at it is if you're in cruise, you're at the lean level of octane. That's what you need to avoid detonation. But when you're in takeoff and you're at high power, you need the rich level. So for the most part, 100 low lead meets the 100, the lean level, and for the most part, depending on the actual fuel itself, will hit the 130 of the rich level.
Right.
But not
It
always.
will meet both. It has
Yeah.
to meet both in order to pass the 100 low lead specification requirements.
Okay. So what is the G100UL? What's the?
So we did the official FAA detonation testing on December 16th, 2020. It was right in the middle of COVID. And the FAA wanted to do it remotely by Zoom to watch the computer screens. And we refused. Said, no, we don't want somebody to complain that the FAA didn't witness that testing in person. We had to get an exemption from Washington, but the then senior propulsion engineer, who was the FAA's in-house subject matter expert on detonation, he came from Wichita down to Ada, and he spent 2 days with us, sitting in the test stand in a chair next to me, just like you are, and we ran through a 3-page line item Excel spreadsheet list of individual fuel tests. We were testing conformed G100UL that was conformed to be the minimum end of the octane range on the specification. And we had standard 100 low lead. We had a minimum spec version of 100 low lead. And so we ran all those tests, and then we did mixtures, mongrel mixtures, 25% 100 low lead, 75% G100, 50-50, and 75-25. We ran all of those to prove that the two fuels were in fact completely fungible or interchangeable in the fuel tank of the airplanes. And we were running all these tests to the FAA detonation test standards for certifying a new engine or a fuel, but we were running them at enhanced manifold pressure that exceeded those requirements by a significant margin. And at the end of the testing, the FAA guy that was sitting to my right, like you are, looks at me, and he had his clipboard, and he said, well, George, he said, we're done. He said, I want you to put a note on the computer file up there and take a screen capture that the FAA says that based on the raw data, you've successfully completed all the detonation test articles. There was, I think, 37 line items on that matrix.
Which meant that the G100UL actually exceeded the 100 low lead performance in all of those tests.
And he said, so we're done? And he kind of shifts in his chair like he's getting ready. I said, no, we're not done. I said, remember, there's one optional item on this test. And he looks at me like, George, you don't have to do that. That's optional. You don't have to do that. I said, well, yeah, but I said, look, his name was Kevin. I said, Kevin, the FAA is here. We're here. The engine's conformed. The instrumentation's conformed, the software's conformed, the fuels are conformed. There won't ever be a better time to do this. Well, George, you don't have to do this. Well, the optional test item was to try and destroy the engine by increasing the manifold pressure until it would no longer pass the test, and we ran the risk of destroying the engine. And he said, well, it's your choice. I said, we're going to do it. So we sat there, and I turned around to the lady that was running the controller for the manifold pressure, and I said, instead of 33 inches, give me 37 inches. And we did. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. We're talking a high compression 8.7 to 1 engine that's rated at 310 horsepower, and we were sitting there running it at 360. Ran the test. It passed. I turned around to her. I said, give me 39 inches, 39 and a half. Okay, we ran the test again, and it passed. And I turned around to her and I said, her name's Laurel. I said, Laurel, give me 42 inches. I thought the FAA guy, Kevin Marks, was going to come out of his chair. So she's sitting there playing with it, and I said, no, you've only got 40, 41. She reaches over and she said, George, the wastegate's fully closed. I can't get you anymore. Well, we ended up at 41, 41 and a half inches. I think it was corrected standard day. We had like 420 or 440 horsepower on that 310 horsepower engine, with all the temperatures set up to limits, hot limits. And we ran the test and passed it easily using G100UL. It's got an enormous margin for full power, full rich engine operation that vastly exceeds not only any other 100 low lead, but any fuel that was used in World War II.
So what would you say, data-wise, that you have that you can say would be the high end of?
We don't know.
Don't
We
know.
weren't able to destroy the engine.
So what was the rate? What was the rich rating at where you ended up testing at 41
Well,
and a half
there's
inches?
no scale to measure that. There's no recognized scale.
Okay.
At the laboratory scale, the scale stops at 161. And when they test the fuel, they say, we can't measure it, but it's somewhere north above 161. And that's all we know.
Okay. And I think the most they did in World War II is 150.
That
I've heard.
was the invasion fuel. The other fuels are typically 114, or 145. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's interesting. Yeah. What kind of fuel flows were you seeing at those at that manifold pressure?
Just the standard full rich fuel air ratio. The OEM specification for the fuel air ratio at full rich, and then we would go down 10% lean of that, which is the way the protocol is. But in that case, in that last instance, instead of being only able to get to 10%, I think we got down like 20 or 25% lean of full rich, and it still was not detonating on this fuel.
I'll run through most of my questions here. I thought I had some hard ones for you.
They're all good ones, so keep it up.
So I guess is it what's the situation with helicopters and experimentals?
So currently the fuel is approved on all type certificated engines in the FAA database, so about 1,300 engines, but
Different makes and models.
makes and models, and approved on all of the airplanes that use those engines, but lacking the rotorcraft airframes. So all the engines for the rotorcraft are already approved, but the airframes are not yet approved. We were close to having that approval signed, and the FAA got a little skittish on it and backed up on us a little bit. Robinson had done some company testing of the fuel that we were going to use for substantiation, and the FAA came back and said, oh no, that has to be done under FAA supervision practices. So Robinson is now going back and doing that, and hopefully they'll have that soon. And we'll use that as well as other testing for rotorcraft and have those airframes covered probably by the end of the year.
Okay. And for experimentals, essentially, most of those are the aircraft engines are certificated engines. So,
Well, some are. I wouldn't say most are.
well, I mean, the road taxes and things like that aren't. But,
Yeah, but they're not bound by certificated operation. But
Right.
Experimental aircraft do not require STCs to use the fuel. And
That's essentially
for
my
the most
question,
part,
yeah.
Whatever experimental engines they have that have successfully operated on 100 low lead will be fine operating on G100UL.
There's a little subtle distinction in there. There are some experimental aircraft that have fuel type in their operating limitations. And in one school of thought, and there's a lot of disagreement in this experimental community, in one school of thought, they say, well, I'm the manufacturer, I can just change that at will. In other situations, somebody would say, well, no, you've got to do another 40-hour fly-off if you do that. What we have done successfully is been able to provide a document that authorizes the experimental aircraft owner to use and rely upon our FAA-approved data, and then they go to their principal maintenance person and say, we have approved data, we don't have to do a 40-hour fly-off. And so far, that's worked every single time that we've done that. So they're not stranded, they're not orphaned. There is a well-defined, well-understood process for every single one of them to be able to use the fuel.
Okay, that's important. What about internationally? What are your plans how to deal with that?
Well, I think We'd like to see a deployment of the G100UL in the US before we try to reach out to, Europe, EASA, for example. We'll probably get validation of the STCs through EASA starting later this year. And they are under the same time constraints for the most part now as the US is, that they're going to be able to make 100 low lead there in Europe until the end of 2030. And so they have a similar problem, a similar time frame. And we'll move over to that in the next year or two.
Okay. I got a lot of friends in Europe and
Yeah,
England.
there are a number of aircraft and engines that are outside the FAA's specific type certification, and so we have to address those as well for EASA purposes.
Yeah, I can imagine it'd be a little bit difficult. There's particularly some of the British engines that are being used over there.
Don't expect any challenges as far as that's concerned.
Are you guys thinking about reevaluating the ASTM process, or you?
Not currently. Not seeing anything in ASTM that I think would really benefit us.
The ASTM does really important, critical work when they define a specific test, like how to do a motor octane number test, or how to do a distillation curve, or how to measure the energy content of the fuel, or how to do a test for gum formation. That kind of work done by ASTM is second to none.
Or what are the complete battery of tests that appropriately ought to define a fuel?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when you start talking about independent fuel specifications, then you've got a lot of competitive, anti-competitive, conflicting interests, and all the participants in ASTM at that point have the potential for conflicted interests. And we ran into some of that initially when we were starting out to do ASTM. And when that became overwhelmingly obvious, the FAA said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. Just go do the STC process. So that's what we've done. Remember, ASTM doesn't approve a fuel. Everybody thinks fuels get approved by ASTM. No, ASTM does not approve a fuel. All ASTM does is to create a specification that defines a fuel. The fuel approval has to happen by the FAA. Well, who approved G100UL? It was the FAA. So the final approval happens by the same governmental entity either way.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, this is my list of questions, actually, and we went a little bit further, so we went in pretty good depth. And I'll take you up on that offer to come up
We
and
look forward to having you.
and see the home, see the factory, and see the engine test stand. And if you guys have any questions that you have for me you want me to pose, leave it in the comments, or send me an email or something, and then we'll address those when I come up to visit. Thanks for joining me today. And
Thanks, Scott.
It was our pleasure. This has been interesting. Good questions. Thank you.
You bet. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.
Well, there you have it, the G100UL story from the principals involved. I'm not going to offer any observations or comments in the video at this time. I'm going to save that for pretty much the last video in the series, as to my opinion about what the hell's going on, what's the future. So stay tuned for that. But the next video in this series is I'm supposed to be talking with Chris DaCosta from the Swift Fuels folks, and we'll see what the status of 100R is. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on FlyWire.